The problem is nobody can just make their own. And yes, I understand there are tutorials and very in-depth guides on how you can make your Raspberry Pi into an emulation station using the RetroPie, all that fun stuff too. But I'm here to tell you, and this is a true story, I've tried to make my own and failed.
So about a week ago, John Riggs of Rig Games put up a very interesting video, and it was called the PSA Don't Build Your Own Raspberry Pi Emulation System, or something to that effect. And I found it super interesting because for me, I've always been about building stuff and tinkering, so it was kind of natural when the Mini NES Classic came out to say, oh, well, you could just build one of those, right? It's not a problem. And for me, it never was a problem, so I didn't stop to think about what it might be like for people who perhaps don't have a lot of time, like John was saying in his video. It's like, hey, he works a full-time job and he's a dad with 3 kids. It's summer vacation now, his kids need him. He doesn't have time to tinker and play with things. And he said, don't hype this thing up, and if you're going to hype it up and people don't know how to do it, at least sell them one. And the thing that I found amusing about the video, and kind of sad as well, I guess, is one of the things that John said, and John is a very technical guy, right? Like he makes his own repros. You see him on his videos soldering and fixing games, so he's a guy who really understands the stuff. He was saying, look, it's just I've tried to build one and I've failed because I don't have the time to tinker with it. And so I went and I looked at some videos for making a Raspberry Pi emulation system, and the truth is the tutorials that I found were not simple. Like, they assume that you want to know all the ins and outs of everything that a Raspberry Pi can do, and people like John perhaps just want to go, get the thing, build it, and play games, right? That's why you want it. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to, in basically real time, take a Raspberry Pi and build a RetroPie emulation system to show John, I hope you're watching, that it is super easy to build these things. And I'm going to build one in about 10 minutes. It's going to go from the stuff that's in these boxes to a fully running emulation machine in 10 minutes. And my challenge to you, John, is going to be, when I'm finished doing all this, I'm going to disassemble it and I'm going to post it to you. And I want you to reassemble it on a video to prove how easy it is to do, and that in fact people should go out and try and build their own.
So the goal of this project is to take a Raspberry Pi and use it to emulate the big consoles. So the NES, the Super NES, of course. Those are the 2 that Nintendo released as minis, but then we want to do also the Atari 2600 and the Sega Genesis, just because they were so big. And just to show that we can do more than the other guys, we're going to do a Nintendo Game Boy also. Okay, let's start off by talking about which parts and tools you're going to need for the build. The first thing, of course, is the Raspberry Pi itself. This is a Model 2, as you can see. You can't buy these anymore, everything's now Model 3. For the purposes of this tutorial, it doesn't matter because you're going to build it exactly the same way for 2 and 3. The difference between the 2 and the 3 is just the 3 is overclocked compared to this one, so it runs a bit faster, and it's got built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. We're not going to mess with that stuff today, so it's going to look and feel exactly the same from the 2 to the 3. This one I got at Amazon for 35 bucks. The Pi 3 costs exactly the same. So that's the machine itself. Then of course we need to power it, so I bought this Canakit USB power supply, which is designed for the Raspberry Pi. Nothing fancy. Essentially what it is, it's like a wall wart like you get for all your devices, etc. It comes with a micro USB plug, which is what the Raspberry Pi wants, and it's rated 5 volts at 2.5 amps, which is what we need for the Raspberry Pi. So this is 10 bucks on Amazon. Now of course we need a nice case to put it in. I got this one, which is the Old School Tools NES lookalike from Amazon as well. This cost me 20 bucks. It's very cute. It doesn't have quite the authentic look of the Mini NES or NES Classic. It's kind of bootleggy, but it looks really nice. The cool thing about this one is that it actually comes with, where are they? Here we go. Heat sinks for the Raspberry Pi. That'll help keep it cool. We are not going to be pushing the Raspberry Pi to the point that it needs active cooling. This will be more than enough. So it's pretty nice that we get them for free with the case. So this was 20 bucks on Amazon. Then of course we're going to need an HDMI cable because the Raspberry Pi puts out HDMI. This one I got at Goodwill for 5 bucks. It's just a regular HDMI cable, nothing special. We of course need a disk for the Raspberry Pi, so I've got this micro USB card. This one is 8 gigs. You can use whatever size you want, 64 gigs, 128, whatever. This is going to hold everything, so it's going to hold the install of Linux, the RetroPie, as well as all your games and save games and everything. So if you're planning to have a lot of games on your machine, get a bigger storage card. The one thing that you do need to look out for is make sure it's a class 10 USB card. If not, your machine is going to perform badly because it's a slow disk. But if you get class 10, it runs great. Then of course we need a controller. Here I got like a really cheap and nasty one from eBay. Cost me $8. It kind of looks like a Super NES controller. The control buttons feel, yeah, they feel okay. I wouldn't want to play, like try and beat Contra with this or anything. The important thing is that it's USB. If you don't want to buy a cheap and nasty controller and you want to use an original one, you can buy adapters on eBay for about $8, which will allow you to plug a regular Super NES controller into the Raspberry Pi. As long as it's USB, you can use anything you want. And then we need a couple of other small things. I got this, which is an adapter that lets me plug in SD cards into my laptop so that we can actually configure everything. So if you've got one of these, fine. Otherwise, this is $4. And then a USB stick. So this is just a regular USB stick. This one is a nudist. He's not wearing any clothes. Don't let that bother you though. Alternative lifestyles will work in this project. What we need this for is we need this to transfer whatever games, ROMs we download onto the Raspberry Pi. And RetroPie makes it super easy. We'll cover that in this tutorial as well. And then the only actual tool we're going to need is this, which is just a small head Phillips screwdriver. So there's no soldering, there's nothing smelly or dangerous or sticky. You can literally build this on top of your bed. So those are all the parts. I'll put all the links to everything in the description. The complete cost is $82 for everything here, except the USB stick, which I just had lying around. So it's about, $85. If you think about that compared to the NES Classic and the Super NES Classic that's coming out, the Super NES Classic is going to be $80 on its own, right? So even if you just buy the NES Classic and the Super NES Classic, you're already spending like $140 versus $85 here. So that's already a good reason to want to do this yourself. Okay, now to make this project work, we're going to need two pieces of software. The first is the RetroPie image, which is basically going to give us the install of Linux, which is going to run the machine, plus all the emulators and everything already pre-configured. And that is RetroPie. So if you come to retropie.org.uk, we're going to hit download, and we're going to look for the Raspberry Pi 2 and 3 image, which is this one. So we're going to download that. It's pretty big, it's about 600 megs. I've already downloaded it, so we won't stop and wait for that. The other thing we're going to need is, once we have this image downloaded, we need to find a way to get it onto our SD card. So what we're going to need is a program that lets us burn that image onto the card, and that program is Etcher. So if you go to etcher.io, you need to just pick the version that you need, and if you want to, of course, you can actually even do this on Mac OS X if that happens to be what you're running, condolences. Otherwise, you can download and install that program, and that will let you then burn your image. So I've already done all those downloads and installed the program, so we can get right to it. Okay, we're ready to start the project. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my USB disk, which is going to be used to transfer the games, the ROM files, between this machine where I'm going to download them and my actual Raspberry Pi, and I'm going to prepare it. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this disk, which is completely empty right now, and I'm going to create a directory in here, which is called RetroPie. RetroPie. And that's it. That's all we have to do to get it ready, and we'll be using that later on. So let me eject that. Okay. Now the next step is to write the disk image that we downloaded, the RetroPie image, onto our SD card. So I'm going to take my SD card, class 10, stick it into my adapter here, and plug it in. Okay. Now I'm going to run Etcher. Start that up. I'm going to select the image we downloaded. Let's see if I can remember where I put it. It was on the desktop. There it is. I'm just going to select the file that I downloaded. I haven't done anything else to it. It checks everything, and then we're going to hit the flash button, and it's going to start. And this is going to be the longest part of this build, actually. It's going to take about 5 minutes to write the image on. And after it starts up, we'll see a time estimate at the bottom here. The cool thing about Etcher is when it finishes writing the disk, it actually does a validation step so you can be sure that everything worked fine. So while those 3 minutes are running, let's do the physical build. Okay, the amount of time it's taken me to move the camera, the disk flash is already halfway through. So, okay. So we're going to set up the Raspberry Pi from a physical point of view, basically get it out of here, get it ready, and put it into our enclosure. So the first thing we're going to do is open the box. Comes in a nice anti-static bag, pop it out, and that's it. That's all there is to it. There's a little pamphlet in here if you care about that kind of stuff. Just so you're familiar with what's going on with the Raspberry Pi, we basically have two chips. There is the big one here, which is the CPU. Let's move that a bit closer. That's the CPU, that's the GPU, the graphics card. Those are the two chips that get hot, so we want to put our heat sinks on there. I'm going to grab my heatsink bag that came with our case. And the cool thing about these is that they come with a sticky heat transferring pad, so we don't need to use any thermal grease or anything. So I'm just going to peel back the protection and then just stick it on nice and straight. There you go. Do the same for the little one. Oh, come on, get the tape off. And stick it on there. That's it, the Raspberry Pi is ready to put into the case. So this is a super simple case. It's just got 4 screws. You get the screws in a little baggie. So all we need to do is line this up. So the USB ports and the Ethernet port are going to face the front, so that when you have it closed, it kind of opens like this. So let's seat that in correctly. Close that. Alright, that looks like it fits. Now let's put the screws in. And that's pretty much it. Once I've got these screws in, it's just a matter of waiting for the SD card to finish writing. And then we'll do the setup. Okay, and actually it's already 10% validation complete, so I better hurry up if I want to finish this in time, by the time the SD card finishes. These kind of self-tapping screws, so it's pretty easy to do. Oh, there we go. And number 3. And then number 4, and we're done. So I've got my little 7-inch HDMI screen here. Well, actually, I guess it's 12-inch, sorry. The next step, once we have the SD card finished, is to power this up and do a little bit of configuration on it. So the way this works is we are going to plug in our power into that USB slot, which comes out of the Pi, like that. We've got HDMI, which comes out over there. This socket you can use for headphones or speakers out if you want, but of course HDMI gives you sound, so we don't need to do anything special. And then you can flip this open and plug in your USB controller in there. And we are ready to play. You'll notice it's got 4 USB ports. RetroPie lets you play multiplayer, so if you want to play with a friend, plug in a second USB controller and you can play 2-player, just like on the real thing. Nice and easy. So our USB validation is at 50%. It says it's got 1 minute left. While that's happening, I'm going to switch the camera around to point at the HDMI monitor so we can finish up. Okay, so the SD card has finished writing and we're ready to turn on the Pi. So the first thing we need to do is insert the card into the Pi. It's got a slot at the back for the SD card. We put it in with the little copper things facing up like this. And it clicks into place. I've already plugged in the HDMI to the monitor and the monitor is powered on. There we go. So now to turn that on, that's the thing that's very simple about the Raspberry Pi. All we're going to do is plug the power adapter directly into it. So we're going to control the power with this, right? We're going to turn it on by plugging in, but when you shut down the Raspberry Pi, as you'll see, we should always use the shutdown command in the menu properly. Don't just yank the power, because you could have data corruption. The same way that you just don't turn off a regular computer at the wall switch. All right, so let's plug it in. And now the machine should be booting. We can see the 4 Pis appear there, the 4 Raspberries. It's taking some, analyzing the disk, does a couple of reboots. It's all the kind of standard setup thing that you'd expect a computer to do. It does a bunch of Linux things the first time it boots. You have to take zero action at this point. Everything is completely automatic. So you just got to kind of sit back and wait for the thing to prompt you for the next step. So now Linux is running, and now it's the RetroPie menu. So now we're going to start getting into actually configuring this to play. And actually the only thing we are going to have to do in terms of configuration is map the controls from our USB into the machine. And the reason we need to do the mapping is because internally the emulator is going to let us use this one controller to play NES, Super NES, Atari 2600, whatever. So it needs to know which of these buttons map to what, like which one is up, which is down, which is A, B, and so on. Because of course this is a Super NES controller, but you could be using like a USB thing that looks like a Xbox controller, right? So that is an action that you need to take only once per controller. So once we've mapped this particular one, you can plug and unplug it as many times as you like, and it'll remember your settings. Okay, so there we go. It says welcome, it's detected, one game pack detected, and it says hold the button to configure it. So I'm going to press a button on the device. It says USB gamepad, and now we're ready. So now it's saying, okay, press D-pad up. So I'm going to press up, D-pad down, left, right, and you can see as I'm pressing them, it's recognizing. So this is axis 0 for left and right. Start, select, A, B, X, Y, left shoulder, right shoulder. Now, at this point, I've run out of buttons on my physical controller. It's asking me for left trigger, right trigger, left thumbstick, etc. We don't have those. So what we need to do is tell RetroPie that we don't have them. So what you do is just press any button and hold it, and then it'll mark it as not defined. So we just need to do that for all of them. And you can use a controller with as many buttons as you want, but you are going to need a start and select button at least, because that's what's going to get us in and out of emulators as we play, as you'll see. So, okay, we've done them all. Now it moves on to OK. I'm going to press the A button, and now it's going to sit a little while. It's writing some configuration files to the disk, etc. And then it's going to pop us onto the main menu. So this is where we are going to kind of select which emulators to play and so on. That's it. Your RetroPie is now finished, configured and running, right? Including the kind of camera switches and everything, that took me about 8 minutes. So now, of course, the only thing we have on the screen is RetroPie. Like, where's my emulators? I want to play some games, dude. What's going on? You will only see the emulators on this list for which you have ROMs actually loaded. So the next step is for us to transfer some ROMs from the Surface using the USB stick, this little guide that we prepared, onto the RetroPie itself. So the first thing you need to do in order to do that is just take the USB stick that we created the RetroPie directory in, and without doing anything else, stick it into your Raspberry Pi. And we're just going to leave it in there, and the light's going to blink, and then we're just going to wait for the light to stop blinking. And at that point, what has happened is the Raspberry Pi has created a whole lot of subdirectories for us. NES, NES, Atari 2600, etc. And so what we'll do is we'll put the ROMs, the games for each of those machines into each directory. And we'll show you how that works right now. Wait for it to finish blinking. It takes about a minute or so. And then at that point, we can actually just pull the disk out. We don't need to worry about doing a proper eject on the Raspberry Pi. But you have to wait for the light to stop blinking. And it looks like it's done. Okay, I'm going to pull that out. Okay, now I'm going to put it back into my Surface so I can copy some ROMs onto it. Okay, my Surface is ready. I'm going to plug this guy back in. There he goes. Okay. Windows gives me a warning here that there's something wrong with the disk. The reason it does that is there is actually nothing wrong with the disk, but because it's been inserted into a Linux machine, it does some stuff to the thumb disk that confuses Windows. There's no need to worry about that. Everything is working just fine. So inside the disk, we've got the RetroPie directory, which we created. And now if we look inside, it's no longer empty. It's got a bunch of interesting directories here. BIOS, configs, and ROMs. We're only going to work with the ROMs one. We'll leave the others for the time being. And if we open the ROM one, there we go. We'll see it's created a whole lot of directories, one per emulator, right? So for example, if we wanted to play Atari 2600 games, I need to take my Atari 2600 files and pop them into the Atari 2600 directory. There's one for Game Boy, which is GB. There is one for NES, and there is one for Super NES, and there's a bunch of other ones, right? Game Gear, Master System, etc. The one thing to notice, by the way, is the RetroPie project is a British project, so there's no Sega Genesis on here, right? Instead, they have Mega Drive, because that's what the Genesis was called in the UK. So now what I want to do is I want to take the ROMs that I've downloaded and I want to copy them into the right directories here. So I have some ROMs here from some of my favorite cartridges, which I downloaded. So let's get the NES ones first. I'm going to select Castlevania 2 and then F117, which I really like. I'm probably the only person in the world who likes that. So I'm going to copy these into the NES directory. And ROM files are typically very, very small. Like an entire ROM game is like, NES game is like, 500 kilobytes. So they're extremely small. And what a ROM file is someone has taken the cartridge which made the game and copied the contents of the chips onto a file. That's what this is. So now I'm going to take my Genesis games. I'm going to take Desert Strike and what is the other one? Gunship. And the reason I know that these are Genesis games, by the way, is because they are .gen files, right? So NES games are .nes, Genesis are .gen, Super Nintendo are .smc, don't ask me why, Atari 600 are .a26, and so on. And you can look up these things on the RetroPie page. They've got some documentation that tells you which kind of file is for what game. So let's copy these Genesis ones across to the Mega Drive directory, paste those in there, and now we are going to take our Atari 2600 ones, Pitfall and ET, because you got to play the worst game on earth on this thing, of course. Atari 2600. And now my Super Nintendo ones, which are the .smcs. I've got Super Strike Eagle, which I really like, and Pilot Wings, which is just a fantastic game. Actually, it's super fun to play. So that was SNES. There it is. Copy those, and then we are going to copy the final one, which is Tetris.gb, so it's a Game Boy file, Game Boy ROM, so we're going to put that into GB. Now you might be asking, what happens if I copy a file into the wrong directory? Well, probably what will happen is you'll try and launch the emulator, and then the emulator will just quit because it doesn't know what to do with the file. So there's no harm in it. It might confuse you, but that's about it. Okay, so now that I've copied all the files, I'm going to eject the disk, and I'm going to put it back into my Raspberry Pi. So let me close that. Here's the Raspberry Pi. I'm going to just directly plug it in. There we go. And now what the Raspberry Pi is doing is it's copying all of the files that we just put on the thumb disk into the correct directories inside its SD card. So we are using the thumb drive as a kind of transportation thing. You don't have to have it in the machine to play, right? And again, we're just going to kind of leave it in. We're going to wait for the light to stop blinking, and then we can pull it out. Give it a minute. Looks like it's done. So I'm going to yank that out. There we go. And now you might be asking yourself, okay, so nothing has changed on the screen. Where's my emulators? We need to restart Emulation Station, which is this front end, in order to see the games that we've updated. So I'm going to press the Start menu, the Start button on my controller. I'm going to select Quit by pressing A. And then I get a couple of different quit options. I can shut down the system, which is what I would do if I wanted to turn off the Raspberry Pi. It does a safe shutdown. I can reboot the system, restart, which is a safe reboot. But all I want to do is restart Emulation Station. And the reason I want to do that is because what Emulation Station does is when it starts up, it scans the SD card to find all of the games it's got installed and then does all the setup for you. So now you will see that we have new options, right? We've got suddenly some names of systems appearing, and I can use left and right to kind of scroll through these: Game Boy, Mega Drive, Nintendo, etc. So now we can play some games. So let's start with Atari 2600. Why not? So I'll press A to select it. It's always A to select and then B to go back, right? That's the buttons that you use here. So we'll select Pitfall. I'm going to press A. And now it's going to launch the Atari 2600 emulator with the Pitfall game running. And there it is. With full sound and everything going just fine. So now we're playing Pitfall. And of course it looks great because it's upscaled to HDMI. And everything's dandy. Okay, now I'm sick of playing Pitfall. I want to play something else. How do I go back to the menu? I press select and start simultaneously, and that quits the emulator and puts me back here, right? So now I can select something else if I want to, or I can press left and right to select different emulators. And you can always press B to go back to the main screen and select them this way. Or I can, in this view, also press left and right to switch between the emulators, right? So I can select Tetris, and playing Game Boy games on a giant HDMI screen is a lot of fun because the pixels are so big. So there we go. And that's Pitfall. Sorry, that's Tetris playing on the Game Boy emulator. And again, the story is exactly the same. We can, you've got all your buttons, etc. Everything works just like on the emulator, just like on the real machine. To quit and go back, select and start simultaneously. That quits the emulator. And I can play all of my games, right? So let's play some Mega Drive, Desert Strike. On the Raspberry Pi 2, the Genesis is about the most powerful machine that you can emulate safely. On the Raspberry Pi 3, though, which is the only one you can buy these days, you can go as far as emulating a PlayStation 1, which is extremely cool. Oh man, that is loud, so let's quit that. And so on, right? So that's it. You've got all your games playing. When you get sick of playing, we press the start menu, brings up this. I'm going to go quit. I'm going to say shutdown system. And now Linux is going to safely shut down, ready for you to go again, right? Takes a little while because, of course, it's a full computer shutting down, right? And that's it. It's shut down. Now, at this point, you can leave the machine plugged in just as is. How do you restart it to play again? Now, this is the kind of bummer of using a Raspberry Pi system, is you don't have a proper power button. So what you need to do is unplug your power supply and then plug it back in. And now the machine restarts. So now we'll see that it's going to reboot. Okay, so that's kind of the one bummer about doing this. And after a little while, we'll go back into Emulation Station and we're ready to play. And it takes about 30 seconds to boot or so. It's not super fast, but it's really not super slow either. You can leave this machine running if you want to. Like I said, it runs extremely cool, and with those two heatsinks that we stuck on, it'll continue running for days without a problem. So you could actually just leave it running all the time if you wanted to, if you don't want to have the pain of having to kind of boot up and then shut down, etc. So that's it. I mean, that is how long it takes to set up a Raspberry Pi to do emulation. So as I said, the actual writing the image and doing the physical build took about 8 minutes, and then copying the ROMs across takes a few minutes as well. The thing to remember about copying ROMs, which I always forget, is after you've copied them to your machine, you have to restart Emulation Station or the entire machine to get them to show up. Otherwise they don't. Beyond that, it is the simplest thing in the world. Okay, so that's it. We went from just a bunch of parts to a fully functioning RetroPie emulation system in about 10 minutes. So, you know, John, I hope this has convinced you that if you kind of ignore all the little intricacies and details, you go straight down the happy path, you can get yourself a RetroPie gaming system put together pretty quickly. And, you know, it's interesting because if you actually do decide to go down some of the, you know, tweaks and menus and change settings and so on, this thing can do a lot of cool things. Like, we showed 5 emulators running. But RetroPie supports about 40, if I remember correctly, right? So not just consoles, so you've got the Master System, PlayStation 1, but computers too. Like the Commodore 64 emulator is built into here. There's Apple II, there's Apple Mac, there's all kinds of cool things. If you're going to do computer emulation, you'll need to plug in a USB joystick and a USB mouse. Just kind of plug them in as normal. You don't need to load drivers or anything. It'll just work, right? So it's super, super easy. The one thing that we didn't talk about in this video is where do I get these ROMs to play with? Obviously, without ROM files, you don't have games, so it's kind of pointless. As you're probably aware, there's a whole debate around the legality of ROMs, etc. I'm not going to go into that here. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand that stuff well. Myself, I believe that if I own the cartridges, the physical cartridges, I'm allowed to use the ROMs for it. I might be wrong. So you should go and educate yourself on the debate, make your own decision. If you decide that you want to go into emulation and download ROMs based on what you've learned, then finding them is pretty easy, right? You just go to search engine, Google or Bing or whatever, you type name of game, name of emulator, ROM, and search for it. Like, you know, Castlevania, NES ROM, just search, you'll find plenty of places to get it from. Just a warning, some of these emulation-based pages are kind of on the darker side of the internet, so make sure that your computer has got its antivirus software updated, etc. before you download anything. The same kind of caution you should take downloading anything, right? So
Once you get the files, you'll kind of figure out the directories to put them in and so on. So that's it. All the links for everything I've downloaded and bought are in the description for the video. John, the challenge for you is I'm going to disassemble this thing. I'm going to post it to you. I want you to put it back together on video in around 10 minutes. So you can show the world that it is in fact that easy. Other than that, I hope everybody has fun getting started in the world of emulation, building your own stuff, playing with your own emulators. So take it easy, and I'll see you for the next one.